Hi. Would you believe that with the end of Second Samuel, we've come to the end of our 11th book of the Bible, even though we're reading others concurrently. Like, I'm so proud of myself, and I'm really just grateful to God for the grace to continue, because I won't even lie, some days it's hard. Some days I'm like, ugh, I really don't feel like, but the more I get to know God, the more I want to know Him. And thank you for staying on this journey with me. So today I'll be sharing the lessons that I learned from Second Samuel 24, read concurrently with First Chronicles 21 to 22, and Psalm 30 as well. So both books began with an account of a census that David took in Israel, but they gave us different details. Second Samuel said that God moved David to take the census, while First Chronicles says that Satan instigated him. Now, in both books, we see a perfect example of how God allows evil to happen, but within his plan, he ultimately works it out according to his purpose. So the most important lesson I think that we need to learn from here is there's a difference between what God allows and what God causes. I don't believe that God caused the census. He allowed it, but we'll see how he ultimately used it for his good. Now, this census wasn't called by God. David did it for reasons best known to him. It could have been, there are different reasons. Some said it had to do with tax, to be able to know how much to tax. It could have had to do with military service, forced labor, or also for him to be to kind of get some sort of self-fulfillment is another school of thought, that he wanted to know just how many people. God had said, I will bless Israel, I'll make them a lot, and then maybe it was like, oh, let me even see how really blessed we are. But whatever it was, it wasn't called by God. Now he sent Joab to do the census, and Joab's response reflected his uneasiness at David's command, and First Chronicles 21 gives more details of his response. The words chosen by the chronicler placed greater emphasis on David's guilt than what else, because Joab was obviously not, it didn't sit well with him, but obviously he had to obey his master. But we will see in later when we continue reading on, that he didn't even finish the census. He didn't, obviously it was something that he was doing half-heartedly. Numbering the people showed a proud spirit, a desire to measure his own greatness, perhaps perhaps express his self-sufficiency. I said before, we don't know for certain. The choice of consequences that God gave David through the prophet Gad were, to me, a test. I couldn't even decide if it were up to me. He gave him 3 consequences, if you remember, but he chose to put himself at the mercy of God. The best choice under the circumstances, if you ask me, because the choices were famine, sword, or a plague. Now, the angel of the Lord was about to strike Jerusalem, but even then, this is David, but even then, David still puts his trust in God's goodness and mercy, and offers himself instead. He was like, why strike the sheep? Strike me, because clearly, the sin originated from him. But God was indeed as gracious as David anticipated, and stopped the plague before the appointed time, and chose at that moment to reveal the location of the future temple. So where the angel of the Lord was that was about to strike was where God had appointed for the temple that Solomon was going to build to be sited. And that was the threshing floor of Aruna or Ornan, depending on what version you read. It was located at Mount Moriah, and if you remember, Mount Moriah was where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac, and that's where he received God's promises as well. So as God offered Abraham an alternative to Isaac, here he also offers David an alternative, i.e. an altar and sacrifice, as opposed to the destruction. I thought that was profound. I think there's even still some deeper things to sort of find out, deeper mysteries in this occurrence But then he offered God offered him an altar and a sacrifice to signify a reconciliation and peace, which brought about the deliverance and a promise of peace. I love how David insisted on paying Onan the Jebusite for the land. He had said, oh, if you want it, you can take it, whatever you want. But he said that he refused to give God something that cost him nothing. Now, that right there is a very important lesson with regards to offering sacrifices to God. And when I say sacrifices, I mean like your praise, your time, your talent. Like, I believe that whatever it is that we need to give God, we want to give God, as long as it is a sacrifice, it has to cost us something. Yeah. Now, David knew the state of the temple, or he knew the site of the temple rather. We see him kick into his role as a planner. So obviously he knew that was the site of the temple, and immediately he started making abundant preparations for the temple. And he was doing that largely due to Solomon's inexperience, because Solomon was still young at this time, and the enormity of the tasks required. He called Solomon and gave him the charge after telling him how God had made preparations for all this before his time, before he was even born, before Bathsheba and him even had any alliance. In verse 12 to 13, he reminds him of the faithfulness of God, and how faithfulness yields prosperity and success. He was advising his son. He gave him words of encouragement for his God-given tasks. Now, here's where I saw God in all of this. God is victorious over sin, always. God allows David's sin of ordering the census, right, even though he knew it was sin, so that he would offer the sacrifice that would ultimately reveal the location of the temple. Even though David was incited to build that, to take that census by Satan, God used his evil motives to bring about his own plan and to bring about the good of the people. Before Solomon was even conceived, before David even sinned against Uriah and Bathsheba, God had already told him about his son who would build a temple for him in future. Because if you remember, God said that David couldn't build it because he had shed blood. And it shows that God's heart towards his people is always true, is always, pure, is always intentional. God always redeems sin, especially when he has a plan. Psalm 30 gives us a song to praise God for who he is. And for knowing all of this, I advise you read Psalm 30 again with in mind, knowing that God is very intentional about you and your sin doesn't stop his plan for your life. Thank you for joining me today. See you tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye.